It's a pleasure to have here fellow central bankers Albert Queralto and Jenny Chan to present their papers on trade and inflation, a very boiling subject at the moment, discussed by my colleague Ines van Robays, ECB, and Giancarlo Corsetti from the European University Institute. Albert, the floor is yours. You have 25 minutes.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for having our paper on. This is joined with Pablo and Ricardo, who are also in the Fed system, and Mikaël, who was a former research assistant, who's now at the UCLA. So it's been great to be talking about inflation this past couple of days. So this is going to be about trade costs and how trade disruptions affect inflation. And our motivation is, in a deeply interconnected global economy, trade disruptions are clearly a relevant issue for inflation. So for the purpose of this paper, we'll think about trade disruptions as, we'll interpret them as shocks to a broadly defined measure of trade costs. And as we all know, there have been recent developments which kind of underscore the importance of this type of disruptions for macro developments and in particular for inflation. And here, obviously, a clear example is tariffs and trade wars and so on, but also supply chain disruptions and the associated inflation surge post-COVID and so on. So despite these, the relevance of these, I'm somehow not able to advance the slides. Oh, yeah, thank you. So despite these developments, I think we argue in this paper that there's a relatively limited understanding of how these trade costs affect inflation, both from the theoretical and the empirical kind of points of view. So there's a lot of discussion, and some of this has come up in this conference about, are these changes in relative prices or, aggregate, or do they affect aggregate price levels? Are they a one-time price increase that sort of policymakers should look through, or are they associated with persistent inflation? So we'll focus a lot on these questions here. From the point of view of the trade literature, there's been a lot of focus of real effects of trade costs, or the real consequences of trade costs. And this, I think, reflects the divide in the literatures that we argue we are trying to bridge in this paper. So the international trade literature has thought about trade costs a lot and the real consequences of that, but they tend to work with real models. The international macro literature obviously thinks a lot about inflation and monetary policy, but they don't think a lot about trade costs. So we're trying to bring these two things together and also kind of highlight the relevance for policy. So the question that we're trying to answer here in particular is, how do trade costs affect inflation dynamics? And the answer in a nutshell that we'll give is that higher trade costs look like an adverse supply shock. So they drive inflation up and GDP down. We'll argue that a key feature or a key aspect is trade in intermediate inputs. So we'll focus a lot about how those are different and relevant. And this also echoes some of the discussion we've been having about networks, supply chains, and so on. So, and kind of the paper has three parts. So we developed the analysis in three parts. The first is empirical. In the empirical part, our goal is to extract from the data a measure of trade costs, and then use this measure to study empirically what are the effects of changes in trade costs. And the way we extract trade costs is by exploiting the gravity equation of international trade combined with bilateral trade flows between countries, and I'll show how we do that. So this gives us a measure over time for country pairs of what are trade costs between these two countries. Then we take this measure in a sort of panel local projection framework to study what are the effects of shifts in trade costs on macro aggregates like inflation, GDP, and so on. So that's the empirical part. The second part is the quantitative model. So we develop a dynamic multi-country general equilibrium model with trade in both final and intermediate goods governed by a gravity equation. sticky prices and wages and the sort of frictions that we use in international macro. And the purpose of the model is to think about the mechanisms that underlie the results we find in the data. But once we have the model, then in the paper, we also use it for a number of experiments related to trade costs. So we think about monetary policy and which measure of inflation it may want to respond to. We think about the effects of the US-China trade tensions of 2018-19. We also think about the drivers of post-pandemic inflation. So those are the three main applications in the paper, which I'll describe if I have time at the end. But here's a preview of the results. So like I said, from the empirical analysis, we find that higher trade costs, so higher costs of importing for a country means that that country experiences higher inflation and lower activity. But we find that the type of dynamics that the shock induces depend on the type of good that the trade costs affects. For trade costs affecting final goods, the effects on inflation tend to be short-lived. But when trade costs affect intermediate inputs, the effects on inflation are much more longer lasting. So, and the model that we write down kind of helps us replicate and think about the drivers of this finding. So the model kind of matches a calibrated version of the model, roughly quantitatively matches the evidence we find and kind of gives a natural explanation for this difference in persistence in inflation that I just described. In the model, when an economy faces higher costs of importing intermediates, this ultimately means that marginal cost for domestic firms rises persistently to the extent that the trade cost rises persistently. Now, a persistent rise in the level of marginal cost in this model and in most models used in macro means persistent inflation. And that's just because of the, staggered nature of price setting. So in this way, we kind of, at the same time, in the same model, a trade cost on final goods has a very short-lived, maybe large, but short-lived effect on inflation. So there's a stark difference between the two. We also find kind of get some magnitudes out of the model with roughly match the data and kind of let us think about, what are give us ballpark measures of what are the effects of rises in tariffs and so on. So we find that like a 10 percentage point increase in US import costs, imagine a 10 percentage point tariff, that means that in the model leads to a 0.8 percentage point hike to inflation on impact, but it has persistent, it's persistent up to 3 years because of this intermediate inputs channel that I explained. Now, I'll just give the key brief headline on the three model experiments that we do. The first is that because of this intermediate inputs channel, the advantage of using a Taylor rule that targets producer prices may be undone or is undone. That's a rule that's been advocated if a policymaker wants to see through the effect of tariffs, say, in a model without these intermediate channels, you would say, okay, you can just target producer inflation, but when you have intermediate inputs traded, that's not the case. So we illustrate that. More generally, I think this underscores the notion that even the idea of seeing through the effects of tariffs on inflation is not straightforward. It's not an easy calculation to make when you have these interconnections and these trading intermediates. In the US-China trade war, we kind of do a quantification there, and we find that the CPI level in the US went up by over 0.4%, and that's due to this persistence of through intermediate inputs, and that estimate is a little bigger than others have found because of, and I think we find this because of the presence of intermediates. Actually, that the trade war, the tariffs were particularly targeted on intermediate inputs overall. So you had more of this smaller but more persistent effect according to the model. And finally, in the sort of Bayesian estimation in the model, we do sort of a shock decomposition of the inflation rise and fall post-COVID, and we find that these trade costs, possibly capturing things like supply chain disruptions and so on, both prevented deflation during the height of the pandemic and also led to a more persistent inflation increase in the later period. So that's sort of a shock decomposition type exercise. Probably I'm not going to show, but that's what we find there. But then kind of going back, having given the headlines, I'll just go a little bit deeper into what we do empirically. So it's sort of, the approach is to use gravity to infer trade costs. It's sort of, the analog would be to use the production function to infer the solar residual kind of a thing. And it's not something that is new to this paper. This is done in the trade literature in various ways. I'll just explain the specific way in which we do it. And I think where we are different from others in that we're going to do this for a broad set of countries, years, and sectors. So imagine a global economy comprised of n countries. Each produces a single tradable good, which can be used either as final household consumption, which will denote by C, or as an intermediate production input M. And this country aggregates goods from different origins, including its own, according to a CES, so an Armington aggregator with elasticity eta. And what is the trade cost here is the standard iceberg cost in trade, whereby to deliver 1 unit of the good to its destination, you need to ship tau units, which is where tau is bigger than 1. And tau here is the trade cost. And we'll just assume throughout that the law of one price holds as well. Okay, so just using this equation, and I'm not going to say anything else about the model now. This part only relies on these assumptions here on this slide. If you let X denote expenditure of one country on another country, and X, just X, so by the total expenditure, then you can kind of write down gravity in this way, where here omega is an expenditure share. So just by minimizing the cost of producing, given the CS aggregator, you get this equation that we're all familiar with, where the expenditure share omega depends on the trade costs and the relative prices. Okay. But then what you can do is, by changing the indices, playing around with who is I and who is H, you can combine versions of this demand equation to get the second equation on the slide, which in the trade literature is known as a head and Rees index. And head and Rees index is a measure of the bilateral trade costs between the IH country pair. And the sort of takeaway of doing this simple calculation is that you can deduce the head and Rees index just from data on expenditure shares. Just from data on how much country A spends on country I spends on country H, and vice versa, and how much each of them spends on itself. Conditional on a value of the trade elasticity. So if you have these bilateral expenditure shares and you have a number for the trade elasticity, you can use this equation to construct the head and Rees index, which gives you a measure of trade costs. So this is what we do. This is the approach we take. So we use data on these bilateral expenditure shares from the ICIO tables, which gives us data on from 1995 to 2020 for 41 countries and 16 sectors. And we use the information in the input-output table to separate these into final goods and intermediates. So that's the core of the data set that we used, and we have a set of other variables that we're going to use as controls and so on. And we're going to use a value of the trade elasticity of 5 here, following the literature. So this just gives a snapshot of what these trade costs look like. Where here in the plot, AE means advanced economy and EE means emerging economy. So AE is costs between advanced economies and so on, EE between emerging. So there's generally, you can observe that these costs vary over time. They reflect growing integration. They change across space. They're different for countries at different levels of development, and they also reflect changes in trade policy. And just to illustrate the second point, you can kind of see how the trade costs between emerging market economies fell much more than for other pairs. That's also because it was starting from a much higher level, but over the period, there was a much bigger decline. And the last point that they reflect changes in trade policy, we can kind of see it in the second chart where we zoom in US, Canada, US, Mexico, US, China. And in particular, if you look at US, China, you see a huge decline between 95 and 2005, reflecting China integration. But if you look later on, you also see an increase around 2017, 18. Okay, and that is exactly the time of the first round of trade tensions there. So this sort of gives a sense that these are plausible, but here, what we do here is we do a kind of a sanity check. So this measure of trade costs does not use any direct measure of trade costs or tariffs or anything. It's just inferred from trade flows. But here we show that if we take some actual measures of trade costs, that it correlates well. And in particular, we take customs duties data from the BEA, just for the US, and we take another measure of tariffs from a paper that Ricardo has for different sectors. And in both cases, the correlation with our trade cost is pretty high. If we estimate this regression here, we find a very significant coefficient, which is close to unity, as you would expect. So there's a sanity check on the measure. Then the main empirical exercise here is to run a local projection of an outcome variable on changes in these trade costs. And here we're doing inflation. And we're sort of being conservative here. We're just showing from period 1 onwards, so we're kind of excluding period 0. And what you see here is that there's a small surge, period 1, for final goods trade costs, but it kind of goes back quickly. But for intermediates, in the second, in your right-hand side chart, the response is persistent. Okay, so this is a 10 percentage point increase in the trade cost that a country faces. Inflation goes up about 0.6, stays high, kind of up to 3, even 4 years out. Okay, so the effect is particularly persistent here. Now we've run this regression with GDP as well, and here you find the GDP decline, which again is larger for intermediate goods trade costs. And this illustrates my claim earlier that these look like negative supply shocks, that the trade activity goes down and inflation goes up. We've also run the same regression for other variables. That's the results are in the paper. So now just moving to the model. So to kind of think about these results, it's a multi-country new Keynesian and trade model with 5 regions, nominal rigidities in both prices and wages, and production requires labor as well as a basket of intermediate inputs, which can be either produced domestically or imported. It's aggregated through an Armington equation, just like in what I presented earlier, and there's iceberg trade costs in consumption and final goods. So this is just a household problem. It's fairly standard. So C here is the aggregate consumption basket, which aggregates across destination sources H, and tau here in the budget constraint is the trade cost. And in the paper, we separate pure trade costs from tariffs, and they look similar. The only difference is that, and this kind of depends on what you assume the government does with tariff revenue. If you assume that the government returns tariff revenue to the consumer, the difference between the two is that in the pure trade cost case, the trade cost is a lost resource, while in the tariff case, it's not a lost resource, so it doesn't show up in resource constraints, but otherwise they're similar. So I think the most new part here that we emphasize more, and that also kind of links to the discussion yesterday on networks and so on, is the production function. So production is CES in labor and M, where M is an intermediate input basket, and the intermediate input basket is a CES of inputs imported from different sources H. And here the sourcing decision is where the trade cost comes in. So tau M is a trade cost that affects the intermediate input specifically. Okay, so that's sort of the problem that the firm solves, the standard cost minimization problem subject to these trade costs of importing inputs from different sources. Then to close the model, we have, this is sort of a sticky price part. The firms produce a homogeneous output yi, which is an aggregate of different varieties. And this homogeneous output is then either used domestically, both as a consumption or as an intermediate input, or it's exported. Now, if it's exported to another country, then in that country, it's also going to be used as either consumption or as an input. If it's used as an input, then those firms will produce a good that is in part exported back and used as an input. So there is a sense of, we don't have sectors, but there is a sense of network and input-output linkages here across countries, because you send some goods out to all the other countries, they produce something with it that they send back to all the other countries and so on. And there's these firms that produce a homogeneous output face nominal rigidities, as in Calvo. And wage setters, here I didn't go over that, but wage setters also have nominal wage rigidity, as in kind of Erskine Henderson-Levin approach. So we take sort of standard functional forms, and we rely on a log linear approximation of the model around the steady state, where we use the trade shares to calibrate some of the omegas in steady states, like how much each country relies on imports from other countries for each of the sectors. Now we have balanced trade in steady state here. This is not necessary, kind of just for simplicity. So this means in practice that we only calibrate half of the omegas and we back out the rest from the balanced trade restriction. So the first result from the first thing we showed from the model is a sort of a comparison against the data. So here thank you. Here the green circled line is the impulse response to a 10 percentage point increase in trade costs for the average country. So that's an exercise that exactly replicates the one from the data that I showed before. And these bars, the black bars, are the confidence intervals from the empirical impulse responses. So you could see sort of first looking at the inflation part, we don't exactly match the data, but we are close, and in particular, the model reproduces the fact that the effect on inflation from final good trade costs is short-lived, but the one for intermediate input trade costs is more persistent. Okay, and if anything in the data is even more persistent than the model implies. And the model also reproduces the fact that GDP goes down, as in the data, although the magnitudes are close, though it's not an exact match, but the model does fairly well in reproducing the empirical effects. Okay, so here we sort of use these to think through the mechanisms a little more. So this shows a 10 percentage point, again, increase in trade costs for the US, in blue for final goods, and in red for intermediate inputs. And the broad takeaway is that the sort of stagflationary dynamics that occur through intermediate inputs are sort of more prolonged, and in both that inflation rises for longer and GDP falls more and more persistently. And this sort of, again, illustrates the mechanisms that I described earlier. So the final goods trade costs is just sort of like the imported part of your consumption basket, and it goes up in price, and that's it. That's very, very close to the one-time increase in the price level, and that's it. And the only reason there's some persistence in the inflation response in that case is that I'm plotting 4/4 percentage changes. If I just plotted quarterly inflation, you would just see inflation rising in the quarter and then essentially going back to zero. It's a one-time increase in the price level. But that's different for intermediate input trade costs. So what happens there is different. So imagine you're a domestic firm producing in the US. Now the price of one of your inputs has gone up. You can substitute away from that and import inputs from other countries or from your own, but neither of those are perfect substitutes. You can also substitute toward labor, but that's also not a perfect substitute. So ultimately, your marginal cost is going to increase, and it's going to increase persistently, and then you're going to pass that through as persistent inflation. And notice that in this case, it's domestic inflation or domestic producer inflation or PPI inflation is the one that's going to rise, kind of by exactly the same amount as actual inflation rises. For final goods trade costs, it's very different. You actually have a decrease in inflation then because domestic real wages fall a little. So, and this kind of behavior of PPI inflation is again the reason why I was mentioning earlier that if you want to see through the effects of, say, higher tariffs, and you want to implement that through a Taylor rule that targets domestic inflation, well, if the tariffs affect intermediate inputs, that's not going to work. So that was the point there, and that's the first bullet up there. Just to go over again the second bullet, we kind of give the numbers for the U.S.-China trade war, and in the final part we do this Bayesian estimation, looking at the drivers of inflation during COVID. You can look at it in the paper. So I'll just wrap up. We find that increases in trade costs are inflationary, but the dynamics depend on the type of good, more persistent for intermediate inputs, and we present a model that kind of replicates these effects. And I'll just leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Great. So hi and good morning, everyone. First of all, a big thank you to the organizers. I mean, this is really a very nice and interesting and relevant conference. And it's my pleasure to be invited here to also discuss this paper today. Yes, this should work. Okay, so I start with the usual disclaimer that these are my views and not necessarily those of the European Central Bank. So I think that Albert did a really great job in presenting kind of the paper, which has as key questions, what is the effect of trade costs on global inflation, and does that actually differ for intermediate versus final goods? It's quite an impressive data set that is pulled together there with input-output tables over 25 years, and actually 41 countries I just learned in a set of 44 here. And then they also then have the intermediate versus final good kind of distinction in the data set. So the methodology is really a very neat puzzle of all kinds of like different approaches that neatly ties together. So first, there's a trade cost that is identified in kind of a gravity model, and that trade cost is used as a trade cost shock in a panel local projections to estimate the impact on, among other factors, inflation. And then you still have a kind of multi-country general equilibrium model that also features this distinction between final and intermediate goods trade to understand a little bit better how does this transmit, why is that different. And then also, as was shown as well, the model is then immediately used for scenario analysis, which is actually also a really nice addition to the paper to understand a bit better on how recent trade cost shocks have then also been affecting and driving inflation in recent years. So the main findings actually are quite simple. So trade costs are surely kind of like inflationary, but it differs for final versus intermediate goods. So for final goods, you have a very short, but kind of like a sharp but short-lived inflationary spike. Whereas if it hits your intermediate inputs, the impact is less strong, but it takes more time to unfold. And then also in the recent applications where there was no time for in the presentation, I think the results are also really intuitive, saying trade cost was actually a major driver of the inflation surge that we saw. And if you think about the persistence, it was not only demand, but it was also supply factors. So these trade cost shocks basically that also explained why inflation was persistently high. So this paper is really a nice paper. I really enjoyed reading it. I think it has a very relevant and timely analysis. As I said, the approach is very multifaceted and very kind of consistent and very neat, I find. And the findings are very, very intuitive and compelling. So the paper kind of consists of multiple parts, as you saw in the presentation. So for this discussion, because I have 10 minutes, I decided to focus a little bit on this empirical link between the trade costs and inflation that is made in kind of the first part of the paper. And my two questions will be, does one setup fits all? And then I also want to talk a little bit about the exogeneity of the trade cost shock. So first of all, does one setup fits all? So because of the methodology in the paper, because you use then this gravity model, you have that trade costs actually encapsulate all barriers to trade. So it's all kind of protectionist measures that you can think of. It's tariffs, non-tariff barriers. So if you have quota, embargo, it's transportation costs, supply chain disruptions, etc. And then of course this is done, as I said, because you have in the model that you map trade flows into trade costs, because you also don't have that data. And then you come up with an elasticity at the end of the paper that shows you, okay, you have a 10 percentage point increase in trade costs, and that is more or less kind of like in the first year affecting your CPI inflation with 0.8 percentage points. And I mean, policymakers love a good elasticity. No, I mean, we like to take this elasticity and we kind of just want to kind of interpret all trade cost shocks that we see and then say, hey, this is the effect on inflation that it will get. And this elasticity is indeed a great one, but when thinking about it, I was just thinking, does this one setup really fits all? And do we need to take that elasticity as something that we can also use in policy discussion? And I just want to give a bit of an example here just to illustrate my point. Here's the price of oil historically, which obviously is a very important intermediate kind of like input and is a very important determinant for inflation. So you had over different times in the past, you had different types of trade costs that was actually hitting that price. You had the oil embargo, which were kind of like in the very beginning in the 70s, was a major shock at the time, inflation, and oil prices didn't come down afterwards. You had supply and exchange disruptions that maybe had less of an impact depending on how big they were. Tariffs were not really noticeable. And then you had the sanctions in Russia, which was a very, very sharp lift, very, very big short-lived kind of like, or quite persistent actually, spike in oil prices. And so my question is then, do all of these type of trade costs actually have the same inflation pass-through? So can we take your trade cost measure and just think that it always will feed into inflation in the same way? And so if you think about it a little bit, so this is also, of course, a simplify, but if you kind of put these three categories kind of, and you compare them with each other a little bit, you might actually have, I would expect at least for them to have different effects on inflation. So tariffs are, they raise import prices, but trade still flows, so it could be a one-off kind of like price level shift, as research has shown recently, and we'll still need to see, for example, how this China-US tariffs also play out in the future. But then you have kind of like, if you contrast that by supply chain disruptions, you will have that import prices will tend to rise more persistently because, I mean, supply chains are very specialized. It takes time to rewire your system. So also when you think about inflation, it affects more intermediate goods. Actually, major shocks can actually spill also over to core inflation. An example we saw of that was definitely in COVID-19. And then if you have an embargo, then there's no trade anymore for a specific point in time, and imports halt abruptly. So you might have very, very sharp spikes in your prices, like we saw, for example, after the EU embargo on Russian oil. So also on inflation there, I would expect a little bit of a different impact. I would expect very large, abrupt price effect that might actually also be quite nonlinear. So, and I think the possible angles to explore in a paper, of course, you have their data limitations, and I understand the approach that you kind of then also take for this. But I think it would make sense to understand a little bit better what drives your inflation, drives your trade costs. And you had one scatter plot in the presentation that I didn't see in the paper, which I think is really going into that direction, which I think is very useful, because I think it would help to cross-validate a little bit with external proxies. You have data. You use custom data, but I think you also have a lot of tariffs data. You have sanction database. You also have global value chains indices that you can use, and you can analyze a little bit more this country pair and sectoral variation that you have in the paper, because you have a lot of dimensions there that you can explore, where you can also perhaps do also event studies on. And why does this matter? This actually matters then for when you use it for scenario analysis and draw policy implications for it. I think it matters kind of like what you mean by trade costs and what your measure actually really captures. So second comment is shorter. This is just about the trade cost shock. So basically you use your measure of trade cost in the local projection, assuming kind of like exogeneity of this, which is of course crucial for the interpretation. So the structural model implies exogeneity, but it's actually not empirically tested. And I think that the paper would benefit a little bit for that, because I at least was questioning that side. And I think that this is specifically important because of the broad definition of trade costs that you have. So the broader your definition of trade costs, I think also the higher the risk is of your indigeneity issue. So super simplified, trade costs rise, inflation rise, but I can think about a lot of other shocks that actually drive both at the same point in time. Think about something that hits your exchange rate, something that hits your commodity market, or something that hit your financial conditions. I think it will also affect your trade costs, and at the same point in time, obviously also inflation. And I think that the country fixed effects that you have in the model might only partially control for it because they are common shocks, but they still affect the countries very differently. And if you say, okay, actually these type of shocks are part of trade cost shocks, then again, I think we're back on my first comment and saying that the interpretation is really, really wide and becomes then a little bit more difficult to really know what this captures. And again, here, I think that there are very simple things to strengthen that case a little bit. So you could strengthen identification of your trade cost shocks. You could just use the data that I mentioned, or that you also use in the scatter plot in your paper, just to do instrumental local projections. I think that would help a little bit with the exogeneity of the shock. You could broaden the controls, and you could actually test whether your trade costs are predictable. I would be curious to see whether, for example, the US-China trade costs, you could predict it with obvious suspects. And then if you can, then you can just kind of take them out of that trade cost measure in your local projections. So let me conclude. So this is really a nice paper. I really enjoyed reading it. I think it's a very relevant topic with a very neat, multifaceted approach. It has a lot of timely applications and a clear policy relevant. But I think the paper could benefit from a little bit, or policymakers at least could benefit from a little bit of a sharper definition of the trade cost shock, because then you would know a little bit what elasticity applies perhaps at what point in time, or where this trade cost concept in your paper fits. So yeah, it's a highly recommended read for both policymakers and academics. And thanks a lot.
Thank you, Elena. I would like to open the floor for questions. Guido?
Thanks. Great paper and discussion. I have just a small point that a lot of, I think, of the words in the policy debate is about the fact that tariffs can redirect trade flows. So, like, you have a think about an endogenous network model, like Michel's job market paper, and you can think about that, because of the tariff, actually the flows will change because I will change the decision about my supplier, and also will change my seller. So is that something that and that would make actually tariff shock on intermediates similar to a supply chain disruption shock, which is, I think, one of the point of the referee. I don't know if you can think about endogenous choices of the network, global network in this model. It would be complicated quite a lot, actually.
Guido stole my question. So count it twice, please, in your reply. You want to maybe answer this and reply to Ine first, while other people think about more?
Yeah, well, thank you for the question, and thank you for the discussion and the comments. So maybe I'll go backward. First, this question. So we don't have an endogenous network choice. That would be cool. It would be like an extension. You can still think about trade diversion in this model. And this is something we have done in other contexts. So you can think about, imagine you're the US, you can set a tariff of the same rate on all countries, or you can set scenario A, or in scenario B, you can set a tariff that's very high on one country, say China, or and then low for the others. But the average is the same in the two scenarios. And then you can use this model to look at the differences. And what you'll find is that the first scenario is worse, because in the second, trade diversion helps you a little bit. And it's interesting, you need to actually get that, you need a high order approximation of the cost. It's about dispersion. In the first order, you lose all of that, but But you can get some of that even with just this model, which has like fixed steady state shares. But of course, we're much more interesting to think about a model where these relationships form endogenously. And there's some work in the trade literature that does some of that. So search of suppliers and establishing relationships and so on. That's very interesting work. So, but yeah, definitely a good direction to go. And now maybe I'll talk about the discussion for a little bit. Just want to say thanks. I'm very sympathetic to all the points you make, and to some extent there are things we could do. One setup fits all. That is true. I mean, we impose that in part. That's just to get statistical power. To some extent, we could explore because we have trade shocks for different sectors and so on. But kind of the goal with, like you're saying, is to get this ballpark elasticity. Like, what is the number? Is it 0.8 or 5 or 3? Like, just get some numbers. If you look at more specific episodes, it's hard because there's more confounding factors. But some other works finds kind of similar effects. And some of our colleagues have kind of looked at the 2018 trade war. And Justin Pierce and Aaron Flan at the board have work using microdata and what were the effects of the trade war with China. And they find something that's pretty consistent with this, that the intermediate input channel mattered a lot, led to declines in employment, and even in the sectors that they were supposed to protect, and it led to increases in prices. Now, of course, when you go that granular, you face other difficulties because, after 2019, there was COVID, and then you can think about the persistence as much and so on. So that's the advantage of our approach, which is kind of more broader. And second point on the exogeneity of trade costs, yeah, that is true. I mean, we take some comfort in the fact that that assumption is true in the model. So, and we take that view in the data. In the model, you can have, and we have, risk premium shocks that drive the exchange rate, monetary shocks, demand shocks, other things, and it wouldn't affect, you would extract the trade cost in the same way. But yeah, I think it would be interesting to think about some exogeneity tests. Yeah, thank you.
See Mikaël in the.
Thanks. I had the same question as Chiara and Guido on trade diversion, but on the empirical part. And I just couldn't yet get my head around how this works, because so if trade costs with one country increase, say there's imports and then there's trade diversion, this would show up as a trade cost reduction for the other countries in your empirical data. Is that the way to think about it? So what we see here right now is already including potential trade diversion. So if we think about the local projections, so if there was no trade diversion, would that imply that the effects would actually be stronger because your empirical data already included? Just clarification of that would be helpful.
No. The point I made about trade diversion was about the model experiment. In the data, there may well be trade diversion following a trade cost that we look at, but the trade cost is exogenous. If you believe that gravity equation, that's the trade cost. And then whatever happens after trade diversion, et cetera, is going to be an endogenous response to that, but it wouldn't feed back into the trade cost.
I thought that the question is that there is a positive trade shock in the country that diverse. No, you're saying that actually to shock, you should pick up the redistribution of trade cost through flows, right? This is, I think, it was this question.
But tau, the actual cost, you think of it as exogenous. The model tells you that's the equation that lets you determine it, and you'll get it right. It's not that you somehow, you're going to endogenously affect one tau from another tau, I don't think.
Yes, thanks for the presentation. I have a model, pose a question for the model and the empirics. Does it matter if the trade cost shock is affecting both countries, like symmetrically? And also in the model, this would be, of course, interesting. I mean, I'm thinking of supply versus demand forces. Now you stress the supply forces a lot, but also if the other countries facing the same trade cost shock, this might be demand shock.
No, this is the relevant point. Like the model in the empirics this head risk index imposes symmetry. Tau IH is the same as tau HI. That's a limitation. That's obviously not true, but it's something we do that lets us build a big data set. So that's sort of a starting point. It's a sacrifice we make. You could use other ways to construct the trade cost that don't rely on this, but then you would have a smaller data set. So that there is a trade-off there that we face. Obviously, in the model, then you can depart from that and you can think about the scenario where tariffs go up and there's partial retaliation or no retaliation, which approximates better what we're seeing now.
I think we can call it an end to the Q&A. Thank you so much again for the questions, the present.